Hello and welcome to today's video. It is on homeostasis, and the Greek word homeostasis, it comes from meaning steady or same, and it's what all living things do to maintain relatively stable environments that are needed for survival. Here is a story of a man called Doherty, and we've been through this in class, and basically in this story we read that he competes in a marathon, and essentially his body temperature just goes way too high, and as a result he was nicknamed by the media as the meltdown man because his organs, his muscles literally began to liquefy, and this just affected various systems in the body, which caused his heart to stop a few times, caused his organs to shut down, and eventually he came very close to dying, but he survived. He lost a leg, but now he goes around speaking about his journey as well. So homeostasis is so important for keeping our body systems in check so that we can survive. Our learning goals for today are: number one, to recall that homeostasis involves a stimulus response model, to recognize different types of receptors and how they are classified based on the type of stimulus. We will recall how effectors can either be muscles or glands. We will interpret feedback control diagrams and understand how metabolism is very closely interrelated with homeostasis, and we just need to be able to explain how so. So we'll look at enzymes and tolerance limits. You can pause the video here and write some kind of learning goal for that. Let's get into it though. So the stimulus response model refers to how do we maintain homeostasis? If we drew it out, well, there's always a stimulus, and that might be a glass of water, which is then perceived or picked up by senses in our body called receptors. So here the eye sees the water, sends that message as an electrical impulse to the brain, the central nervous system. The brain then perceives that, understands it, sends a message to our muscles saying, yes, I want that, contract, lift it up, and there's the response. So we have different types of receptors, which we'll talk about. And we'll also talk about the effector, how that can either be a muscle or a gland. So what could this look like? Well, let's talk about the negative feedback loop. Here we have, say, a picture of Homer, and he's exercising, and so his core body temperature increases. Our brain picks that up, our hypothalamus, and the opposite response to an increasing body temp is to bring it back down. So we do this by causing our body to begin to sweat, to begin to vasodilate, which means open up, widen our blood vessels, which will bring blood closer to the surface of our skin, so the heat from our blood can then diffuse into the outside environment. But what happens, say, if the body temperature declined too much? Well, we would get cold, and so as a response to that, we'll need to start shivering. What's the opposite response to being too cold? We would start to shiver. That generates heat, metabolic heat, when we start moving and creating energy. Heat is a byproduct. Also, our hairs will stand upright. We'll have goosebumps, and this is said to create like warm pockets of air in our skin, even though it's so small. Goosebumps are also thought to be a process that we still have, but it was used in evolutionary for our hair fur to stand up to make us look bigger and all that kind of thing. But goosebumps and shivering, that will cause our temperature to increase. And basically what I want to just pull out from this diagram is when there is a stimulus that is perceived and our body does the opposite, a counter effect to that stimulus, that is called negative feedback. And if I talked about this in relation to this, is called a guilt sign. So say the speed limit is 10 and you see you're doing 25. Well, negative feedback would mean you see that and then you bring it back down. The opposite to that is called positive feedback. And we're going to talk about that in a sec, but just to finish up on negative feedback. So homeostasis does not involve keeping conditions static, but it means to doing counter effects to bring them back down, or if our temp's too high, but then if our temp goes too low, it goes back up. So it fluctuates up and down. as opposed to positive feedback. This is more rare, but the classic example is pregnancy or childbirth. So say when the baby presses on the cervix, that stimulates contractions, and contraction stimulates further pressure, and that stimulates more contractions, and it's just this process of increasing and increasing and increasing the message. The example would be, you see the speed limit and you see that as a challenge, and you keep going up 35, 45, 55, 65. Same thing in here. So we will talk about effectors, how they can be muscles or they can be glands. Glands are also involved in this process of stimulating different hormones that also help in this whole delivery and birth of the baby. So that is negative and positive feedback. And again, the stimulus response model. So if we move on, different types of receptors. We said, well, the eye is a receptor, but let's speak more specifically. There are chemo, thermo, mechano, photo, and nocebo, which are pain receptors. And these receptors are classified, if you haven't noticed, based on what they do, based on what they pick up. So here's a table that just shows that mechanoreceptors, like mechanical, it refers to movement. We have these in the cochlea of our ear, and they are these little hair cells that pick up pressure. That is like sound waves, movement, I mean. We also have baroreceptors, which pick up pressure, but we have mechanoreceptors in our skin that we can pick up touch. They are located in our ears, arteries, and skin. We have chemoreceptors, which pick up chemicals. One example of that is this nerve that kind of up in our nasal passageway, it picks up smells and chemicals in the air and solids, and it can determine pH. We also have thermoreceptors. And so the example here is we have them in our skin, where if we put our hand on a hot stove, that message is sent to our brain, which says hot, move. And so we would then send a message to our muscles, which would contract in our arm and move our hand away from that hot stove. But we also have, like I said previously, in the hypothalamus, this little part of our brain, this region that determines internal changes in temp. So sensory receptors can pick up external or internal stimuli. And lastly, photo. Photo means light, and we have these in the back of our eye on the retina, which pick up light images, the spectrum of light, which then sends that as an electrical impulse to our brain, which then perceives that image. So there's a few sensory receptors that we have classified based on the type of stimulus. So metabolism. Metabolism actually refers to all the chemical reactions and processes that occur in our body to maintain or sustain life. The two main types of chemical reactions that can occur in this process, you might know as anabolism and catabolism. Catabolism, I remember, it sounds like catastrophe, breaking things down. It's this metabolic pathway that breaks down large molecules into smaller ones, and the big example of that is when we ingest food, we want to break those large sugars and molecules down into their simplest, smallest forms so that we can then build them up into exactly what we need them to be. As opposed to anabolism, which is the opposite. It's a set of metabolic pathways that synthesize larger molecules from smaller ones. So here we are building things up. And basically, if we tie this into energy, this releases energy when we break things down, but this actually requires energy to build things up. And so how does metabolism tie into homeostasis? Well, for metabolism to take place, to break things down or build things up, we need enzymes. And enzymes work in optimal conditions. They have tolerance limits. So if temp's too high or pH is too high or low, then they lose their functionality. And if it's way too out of their optimal conditions, they actually denature and change shape and can't do what they need to do. And therefore, if we can't do metabolism, we can't sustain life. So that's why homeostasis is so important, to keep our body in check, to keep these optimal ranges happening so that our enzymes can do what they need to do to sustain life. And enzymes do everything in our body. They're so important. So metabolism and homeostasis are interconnected. Lastly, feedback control diagrams. QCAA says we need to look at these diagrams and be able to see what's going on, to recognize the stimulus, the receptors, control center, effector, and just the communication pathways. And if you look at this, you might be able to figure it out already. So here we have the stimulus, which is hemorrhage, and that's this massive loss of blood within a short time frame. And what that's going to do is cause a decrease in blood pressure. And so negative feedback kicks in. What are we going to do to counteract that stimulus? Well, this is where the pluses come into it, to increase our blood pressure. That's what's gone down. We're going to do a few things right. Number one is we're going to reabsorb fluid. So if we have extra fluid around the body and cells and between cells, we're going to increase that our blood pressure by absorbing that back into our blood. Also, and if you follow that pathway around, it will bring it back to blood pressure. My mouse is actually frozen on my screen right now, so I don't know if it's moving for you, but it's not for me. But then there's another pathway. We've got renal conservation of fluid. So that means instead of diluting all that urea and losing a lot of liquid fluid through our urine, we're actually going to conserve that. Renal means kidney. And that's going to come back, and you can see that's going to increase blood pressure. Then thirdly, we have production of vasoconstrictor substances. So that's these substances that are going to cause our blood vessels to constrict. That means make them more narrow. And if we have the same volume in our vessels, but we make those vessels more narrow, what that is going to do, vasoconstriction, is also going to, there we go, increase our blood pressure. And that's how we make sense of this. So here we have stimulus, which would be picked up in our receptors, and then we have all these pathways which are going to be the communication pathways. We'd have our brain, which picks up changes in pressure, changes in tempo, all of that kind of thing, and then that would send a message to our glands or to our muscles to do these kinds of things like vasoconstrict. So that is a feedback control diagram. And that is all for today. So as always, your homework is to read the chapter. That is chapter 9 from your textbook, and add keywords to your glossary. Or also do something creative. Can you create or represent an example of a real life negative feedback loop, or even anything to do with homeostasis? It may be a drawing, a written scenario, a case report, or anything else. But that is all for this week. I hope that you have found this video helpful and engaging, and I will see you in class. God bless.